Jax's revenge domain. The explosion that destroyed my 35-year career happened at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I wasn't there when the 800 psi gas line blew. I was 20 miles away, watching the news helicopter footage and thinking, I tried to warn them. The twisted metal crater where Garrett Cross's pipeline used to be was exactly what I'd predicted 3 weeks earlier when he fired me for refusing to sign off on a death trap. My name is Wade Sullivan. I'm 61 years old, and I've been inspecting high-pressure pipelines since before Garrett Cross knew what natural gas was. But let me back up and tell you how we got to that crater, because this story isn't really about an explosion. It's about what happens when corporate greed meets 35 years of hard-earned expertise, and why you should never let some suit in an office tell you how to do a job they've never done. There's a specific sound that 800 psi makes when it's rushing through a 24-inch steel pipeline. It's not a roar, it's a whisper, a low, steady hiss that you feel in your bones before you hear it. To most people, it sounds like progress. To me, after 3.5 decades in this business and a Purple Heart from Vietnam, it sounds like a sleeping beast waiting for someone to make a mistake. It was 5:30 a.m. that morning, 3 weeks before the explosion. The sun was just breaking over the Gulf Coast horizon, painting the refinery towers orange and red. I was already suited up in my inspection gear, standing next to the main distribution manifold at Summit Energy's newest facility. The smell of salt air mixed with hydrocarbon vapors hung heavy in the morning humidity. This was Texas at its industrial finest. Billions of dollars of infrastructure humming with the kind of power that built America, but could kill you in a heartbeat if you didn't respect it. Wade, how's the pressure reading on Section C? Roy Washington's voice crackled through my radio headset. Big Bear, as we called him, had been my right hand for 15 years. If I was the brain of this operation, Roy was the muscle and the heart, a good man who understood that in this business, there's no such thing as close enough. I looked at my ultrasonic thickness gauge. The screen showed measurements that made my stomach drop, numbers that meant somebody was about to die if we didn't act fast. Bear, we've got wall loss down to 0.18 inches. Spec minimum is 0.312. This joint is paper thin. Copy that, Wade. What's your recommendation? Immediate shutdown for full section replacement, I said, keeping my voice steady despite what I was seeing. We're looking at catastrophic failure if we run commissioning tests on this. The corrosion is eating through the external coating and we've got active pitting along the entire joint. The silence on the radio told me Roy understood. After 3 decades in this business, you develop a sixth sense about metal fatigue and pressure stress. This wasn't a maybe, this was a when. And when 800 psi of natural gas decides to find its own way out of a pipe, it doesn't ask permission. I spent the next 2 hours documenting everything with the thoroughness that had kept me alive through 35 years of dangerous work. Ultrasonic readings, photographic evidence, corrosion mapping. Every measurement recorded, every angle photographed, every potential failure point cataloged. I'd been doing pipeline safety inspections since the Carter administration. I'd seen what happens when companies cut corners on pressure testing. Bodies don't survive 800 psi gas explosions, and the lucky ones die quick. This particular setup wasn't just feeding office buildings. It was powering a complex of chemical reactors that processed petroleum derivatives worth millions. If the gas supply fluctuated for even 30 seconds, the temperature controls would fail, and millions of dollars of polymer resin would harden into worthless blocks, destroying the equipment permanently. But that was just money. The real concern was the 200 workers who'd be standing next to this pipeline when Garrett's corner cutting caught up with him. I was the only inspector on this site certified for high-pressure transmission systems. That certification wasn't just paperwork, it was thousands of hours of training, field experience that cost more to maintain than most people's trucks, and the kind of knowledge you can't get from YouTube videos or college textbooks. You don't get old in this job by guessing. You get old by being right every time about things that can kill you. I climbed down from the inspection platform and started stowing my gear with the methodical precision that had become second nature. Every tool had its place. Every measurement had been recorded twice. You don't survive 35 years of pipeline work by being sloppy. And you sure as hell don't survive by letting some MBA who's never held a wrench tell you how to do your job. That's when I saw the white Escalade tear through the construction entrance, throwing gravel as it skidded to a stop near the site trailer. Even before the door opened, I knew this was going to be trouble. Garrett Cross stepped out looking like he'd rather be anywhere else than a working industrial site. Even in the Texas heat, he was wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly pension would be. His Italian leather shoes were already getting dusty from the industrial site, and he had that look rich kids get when they have to deal with actual work, like the whole thing was personally offensive to him. He marched toward me, pointing a manicured finger that had never seen a day of honest labor. "Sullivan!" he shouted across the work site. "Why isn't the commissioning team here yet? We're supposed to start pressure testing at 8 a.m. sharp. Do you have any idea how much money we're burning while you're playing around with your little gadgets?" I wiped pipeline mud off my hands with a rag, taking my time. 35 years in this business had taught me that panic was contagious, but calm was professional. "Morning, Garrett. The testing is delayed because we have a serious problem that could kill people." Garrett stopped 5 feet from me, wrinkling his nose like the smell of honest work offended him. He was the kind of man who'd inherited his father's energy company and spent the last decade expanding it by cutting every corner he could find to underbid the competition. Problem was, in the pipeline business, corners have a way of cutting back. "I don't pay you to find problems, Sullivan," Garrett sneered, adjusting his tie like he was getting ready for a board meeting instead of standing next to equipment that could vaporize half the county. "I pay you to rubber stamp approvals so we can get this facility online. The state regulators are coming next week for final inspection. I need those reactors hot and running by Friday, not next month." I pulled out my tablet and showed him the ultrasonic readings, the kind of data that had kept people alive for 35 years. "Look at these wall thickness measurements, Garrett. Section C is compromised. The corrosion has eaten through 60% of the pipe wall. If we pressurize this system to operational levels, it will rupture." Garrett waved his hand dismissively, like he was swatting away a fly instead of dismissing potentially fatal safety data. "It's just metal, Sullivan. Slap some sealant on it and certify the system. That's what you pipeline guys do, right? Fix things with duct tape and move on?" My jaw tightened. This wasn't ignorance talking. This was willful negligence, the kind that gets good people killed because somebody in an office decided that safety margins were just suggestions. "Garrett, we're talking about 800 psi natural gas flowing through a compromised joint. If that section fails, it won't just leak. It will explode. The blast radius could take out half the facility and everyone in it." "Half the facility?" Garrett's face turned red to match the sunrise. "You're being dramatic, old man. This is exactly why I'm tired of dealing with dinosaurs like you. Everything is a catastrophe. Everything is the end of the world. You military guys are all the same, always looking for the next war to fight." That hit differently than he intended. I'd learned respect for consequences in Vietnam, where mistakes got people killed fast and forever. But I kept my voice calm, using the tone I'd perfected over 3 decades of dealing with people who confused authority with competence. "I need to file a stop work order with PHMSA and the state fire marshal," I said. "This system cannot be pressurized until that section is replaced. It's a 48-hour job with the right materials, maybe $200,000 in parts and labor. That's nothing compared to what you'll lose if this thing blows." Garrett laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the reactor towers like a gunshot. He looked around to make sure his construction crew was watching because everything with Garrett was performance. Everything was about proving. He was the alpha dog on his own construction site. "Your stop work order?" Garrett mocked. "You think you're in charge here, Sullivan? You're just a glorified maintenance man with a clipboard and too many opinions. Don't act like you're some kind of engineer just because you've got military stories and a fancy inspection certificate. I'm a certified pipeline integrity specialist," I corrected him, keeping my voice level. "And under DOT regulation 192.917, I have the authority to halt operations when I identify immediate safety hazards. This isn't a discussion, Garrett. This is me telling you that people will die if you ignore this." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Roy Washington, standing by the equipment trailer, looked down at his boots. He knew I was right, but he also knew Garrett signed the paychecks for a crew of good men who had families to feed. In this business, being right doesn't always pay the bills. Garrett stepped closer, invading my personal space, in that way bullies do when they think intimidation works better than intelligence. I could smell expensive cologne mixed with coffee breath and the sour scent of a man who'd never done an honest day's work but somehow thought he was qualified to override 35 years of expertise. You know what your problem is, Sullivan? Garrett said, his voice getting louder so the whole crew could hear him establish dominance. You're old, you're slow, and you think your military service makes you special. This isn't Vietnam, Grandpa. This is business. This is the real world where schedules matter and money talks. Experience costs money, I said simply, the way you'd explain something obvious to a child. Safety costs money. But explosions cost lives, and dead workers cost a hell of a lot more than replacement pipe joints. Pipeline inspectors are a dime a dozen, Garrett shouted, throwing his hands up for dramatic effect like he was conducting an orchestra of stupidity. I can hire 3 guys fresh out of trade school for what I pay you. I'm tired of your lectures and your scare tactics and your military this and safety that. I need people who want to work, not people who want to find excuses to delay my timeline and cost me money. He turned toward the site trailer and whistled sharply, the way you'd call a dog. Danny, get out here. We're making some personnel changes. The trailer door opened and Danny Morrison, Garrett's golf buddy and general yes-man, jogged out looking confused by the tension crackling through the air. Danny was 38 years old with a brand new hard hat that didn't have a single scratch on it and 0 pipeline certification. He was a nice enough guy who could probably change the oil in your car without screwing it up. But he couldn't tell the difference between a pressure gauge and a flow meter, much less understand the deadly mathematics of high-pressure gas systems. Yeah, Garrett? Danny asked, looking around at the crew like he'd walked into the middle of a family. Fight! Garrett pointed at me, then at the pipeline manifold that could kill them both. Sullivan is leaving us. You're taking over as senior inspector. I felt ice form in my stomach. Not for me. I'd been expecting this the moment Garrett opened his mouth, but for the workers who'd be standing next to that pipeline when it finally let go. For Roy and his crew, for the chemical operators, for everyone who trusted that the people in charge actually knew what they were doing. Garrett, you can't be serious, I said, making one last attempt at sanity. Danny doesn't have PHMSA certification. He's never worked on transmission-level systems. Hell, he's never even seen pressure this high outside of a textbook. He's smart, he'll figure it out. Garrett scoffed with the confidence of someone who'd never had to figure out anything more dangerous than a golf scorecard. It's just pipes and gauges, Sullivan. Danny, take the inspection equipment from the old-timer. Danny looked absolutely terrified. He glanced at the massive pipeline assembly humming with enough energy to level a city block, then back at me with eyes that said he knew this was insane but didn't know how to stop it. Garrett, Danny said, his voice small and uncertain. Wade usually handles the high-pressure stuff. I mostly do low-pressure residential lines. Maybe we should shut up and take the equipment, Garrett snapped, his patience gone now that he'd committed to this course of stupidity. He turned back to me with a smug grin that said he thought he'd won something instead of just signing death warrants. You're fired, Sullivan. Get your gear and get off my site. I'm docking your final paycheck for the delays you caused this morning and every other time you've slowed down my operation with your paranoid safety theater. I looked at the tablet in my hands, then at the corroded pipeline joint that was ticking like a time bomb, then at Garrett Cross, a man who'd never done a day of real work in his life but somehow thought he was qualified to override 35 years of expertise earned in blood and mud and the kind of mistakes that teach you to never make them again. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I'd given my professional opinion to a man who valued his schedule more than human lives, and that opinion had been rejected by someone who confused authority with intelligence. In the military, we had a saying, you can't fix stupid, but you can document it and get clear of the blast radius. Okay, I said, handing the tablet to Danny's trembling hands. The kid looked like he was about to throw up, which showed he had better survival instincts than his boss. Good luck, son. And Danny, stay away from that Section C joint when they start pressure testing. Find a reason to be somewhere else. I walked to my F-250 and started loading my personal equipment with the same methodical precision I'd used for 3 decades. My pressure testing kit, my ultrasonic gauges, my safety gear, all of it, purchased with my own money and calibrated to standards that had kept me alive through situations that would have killed lesser men. Where do you think you're going with that? Garrett barked, following me like a yapping dog. Company equipment stays on site. Read my contract, Garrett, I said, latching my equipment case with finality. I provide my own certified instruments. You provided the headaches and the lawsuit waiting to happen. I climbed into my truck and fired up the diesel engine. As I drove toward the exit, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw Garrett patting Danny on the back, pointing at the pipeline system that could kill them both. The sight made me sick to my stomach, but there's only so much you can do to save people from their own stupidity. I checked the time, 8:15 a.m. The pressure in that corroded joint would continue rising with the morning heat and the planned commissioning tests. I gave it 2 weeks, maybe 3 if they got lucky with the weather and didn't push the system too hard. I was wrong. It didn't take nearly that long. The next 3 weeks were the longest of my life. Word travels fast in the pipeline industry, and Garrett had made sure his version of events reached every major contractor in Texas before I'd even gotten home. According to him, I was a washed-up troublemaker who'd sabotaged equipment and walked off a critical job. The phone calls I expected never came. The industry that had been my life for 35 years suddenly treated me like a plague carrier. I spent the days in my workshop rebuilding the transmission in a 1969 Camaro I'd been tinkering with for years. It was therapeutic work. If a part was broken, you replaced it. You didn't tape it up and hope for the best. You didn't ignore the problem because fixing it was inconvenient. You did the job right or people got hurt. Roy Washington would call me every few days with updates that got worse each time. "It's a nightmare, Wade," he told me during one of our clandestine meetings at a truck stop outside the city. "Danny's got the crew working 16-hour shifts to make up the schedule. No overtime pay, just promises of bonuses when the project comes online." "What about the pipeline?" I asked, cutting straight to what mattered. "Getting worse every day," Roy said, looking exhausted. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his hands had a slight tremor that hadn't been there before. "The pressure testing has started, and that corroded joint is singing like a tea kettle. You can hear it from the parking lot now. The temp workers Garrett brought in are scared to go near it, but they don't have the training to understand why." I shook my head. "It's stress fracturing internally. The wall is flexing under pressure, creating micro cracks that spread every time they cycle the system. It's a bomb, Roy, and the timer is running down." "I tried to tell Garrett," Roy said. "He told me if I mentioned the pipeline one more time, I could join you on the unemployment line." Roy slid a folded paper across the table. "I probably shouldn't show you this, but you told me to document everything." I unfolded it. It was a purchase order for emergency response equipment, hazmat suits, evacuation vehicles, and a trauma helicopter on standby. The delivery date was scheduled for the day after the final state inspection. Son of a bitch knows, I realized. He knows the system is unstable. He's trying to limp it through the regulatory approval, get his final sign-off, and then deal with the failure after the state gives him the green light. "There's more," Roy said. "He fired the third-party safety consultants last week, said we're doing internal inspections now. Danny's signing off on all the pressure test reports." My stomach dropped. Danny Morrison signing pressure vessel certifications was like a toddler signing nuclear launch authorizations. "Roy, you need to get the crew as far away from that manifold as possible when they run the final tests. Find excuses. Create diversions. Just don't let good men die for Garrett's schedule." The call came on a Thursday afternoon. I was in my garage, cleaning the Camaro's carburetor and trying not to think about what was happening 20 miles away, when my phone lit up with a breaking news alert that made my blood run cold. "Explosion at Summit Energy Facility. Multiple casualties reported." My hands went numb. I dropped my wrench and ran inside, fumbling for the TV remote. The helicopter footage showed devastation that was somehow both exactly what I'd predicted and worse than I'd imagined. The main pipeline manifold was a blackened crater surrounded by twisted metal and emergency vehicles. Black smoke poured from the rupture point like a funeral pyre. The chemical reactor building was dark and silent, its million-dollar equipment reduced to expensive scrap metal. But it was the human cost that hit me in the gut like a sledgehammer. Emergency vehicles were everywhere: ambulances, fire trucks, hazmat teams. Paramedics were loading stretchers into ambulances while investigators in protective suits moved through the wreckage like ghosts. I grabbed my phone and dialed Roy with shaking fingers. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Still voicemail. Panic, cold and sharp, filled my chest like ice water. If Roy had been near that manifold when it went up, if good men had died because Garrett Cross was too arrogant to listen to 35 years of experience. Then my phone rang. Roy's name on the caller ID. "I'm okay," he said before I could get a word out, his voice rough with smoke and adrenaline. "We're all okay, Wade. Mostly." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "Where were you when it happened?" "I remembered what you taught us about blast zones," Roy said, his voice shaking with exhaustion and relief. "When they started the final pressure test for the state inspector, I moved the whole crew to the far side of the compound for a mandatory safety briefing. Garrett was screaming at us on the radio to get back to work, calling us cowards and time wasters. Then boom. Anyone hurt? Danny, Roy said grimly. He was in the control room when the pressure wave hit. Flying glass, some burns from the fireball, but he's alive. The paramedics took him to Herman Hospital, kid's lucky to be breathing. And the facility? Total loss, Roy said. The explosion took out the main distribution system, secondary feeds, everything. The chemical reactors shut down when they lost gas pressure. The polymer feed lines are contaminated with debris and toxic smoke. Wade, they can't restart production. The whole operation is finished. I closed my eyes, seeing in my mind the millions of dollars in equipment now reduced to smoking rubble. How's Garrett handling it? Having a complete breakdown in the parking lot, Roy said. Throwing up every few minutes, walking in circles, keeps asking how this could have happened. The state investigators are already here, and word is the feds are on their way. Tell everyone to go home, Roy, I said quietly. Document everything for the investigators, but get our people out of there. This is going to be a circus, and working men always get blamed when rich men's plans go sideways. Yeah, Roy said. It's over. But Wade, I think your phone's about to start ringing. Roy was right about my phone ringing. It started 20 minutes after the explosion hit the news. Unknown numbers, federal investigators, attorneys who smelled blood in the water. Then, inevitably, Garrett Cross himself. I let it ring, watching his name flash on the screen like a distress signal from a sinking ship. Maxwell Foster called me 30 minutes later. Don't answer anything yet, he commanded, his voice sharp with the kind of focus that had made him the most feared labor attorney in Texas. Let the desperation marinate. Right now, Garrett is trying to spin this as an unforeseeable accident, maybe blame it on equipment failure or an act of God. He's looking for a scapegoat. And you're the obvious target since you're the guy who sabotaged his project by walking away. The facility is destroyed, Max. I know, Max said without a hint of sympathy. And every hour that passes, your value goes up exponentially. The federal investigators aren't stupid. They're going to ask for maintenance logs, pressure test records, inspection certifications. When they find out those don't exist, or that they were signed by an unqualified golf buddy, they're going to look for the man who tried to warn them. I spent that night watching the news coverage, seeing my professional predictions play out in real time on live television. They interviewed Garrett briefly outside the hospital where Danny was being treated. He looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. Tie hanging loose, expensive shirt stained with soot and vomit, eyes hollow with the kind of shock that comes when your chickens finally come home to roost. This was an unforeseeable industrial accident. Garrett stammered into the reporter's microphone, his voice shaking like a man trying to convince himself as much as the cameras. We followed all applicable safety protocols. Our team is cooperating fully with the federal investigation. Lies. Every word was a lie, and he knew it. But lies have a way of catching up with you in the pipeline business, especially when they're lies that get people hurt. At 3 a.m., my doorbell rang. I flipped on the porch light and saw Garrett standing there, swaying like a tree in a hurricane. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, which was probably true. He was holding a bottle of bourbon in one hand and what looked like legal documents in the other. Wade, he slurred through my front door. We need to talk, man. I can fix this whole thing, but I need your help. I didn't open the door. 35 years of dangerous work had taught me to recognize desperation, and desperate people do stupid things. Go home, Garrett. You're drunk and you're about to say something. That'll get you arrested. I need you to sign these amended inspection reports, he yelled, waving the papers like a white flag of surrender. Just backdate them to last week. Say you cleared the system for operation before you left. I'll pay you $100,000 cash right now, tonight. We can make this whole thing go away. I stepped back from the door, genuinely disgusted. He wanted me to falsify federal inspection documents, to commit perjury that would send me to federal prison just to save his worthless hide. Get off my property, Garrett, or I'm calling the police. He stared at me through the glass, desperation and rage warring in his bloodshot eyes. Then he spat on my porch like the spoiled child he'd always been and stumbled back to his Escalade. I called Max immediately. He tried to bribe you to falsify federal documents? Max asked, instantly alert despite the hour. Caught on my security camera in full HD, I confirmed. Beautiful, Max whispered. Absolutely beautiful. He just handed us his head on a platter. The next morning brought a parade of federal investigators, insurance adjusters, and corporate lawyers scrambling to contain a disaster that couldn't be contained. By noon, the FBI had arrived. By evening, Garrett's assets were frozen and his company was under federal investigation. The call I'd been waiting for came 3 days later. Not from Garrett's lawyers trying to cut a deal, but from Agent Sarah Martinez of the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. "Mr. Sullivan," she said on Max's speakerphone, "we're opening a federal investigation into possible violations of the Pipeline Safety Act and criminal negligence. We understand you filed safety concerns prior to the incident." "That's correct, Agent Martinez. We'd like to interview you as a witness. We're also prepared to offer you a consulting position with our investigation team, if you're interested in helping us understand exactly what went wrong here." I looked at Max, who was grinning like a wolf, watching a rabbit walk into its den. "Agent Martinez," Max said, "Mr. Sullivan would be honored to assist federal law enforcement. But first you should know about Mr. Cross's attempts to intimidate and silence him, including the attempted bribery we recorded 3 nights ago." The federal investigation moved with the efficiency of people who had unlimited resources and a clear-cut case of criminal negligence. Within 2 weeks, they'd seized Garrett's computers, frozen his bank accounts, and issued warrants for company records going back 5 years. I testified before a federal grand jury about the pipeline condition, the refused shutdown, and Garrett's desperate attempt to bribe me into falsifying records. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Kim, treated me with the respect due a 35-year professional who'd tried to prevent exactly what had happened. "Mr. Sullivan," she asked, "in your expert opinion, was this explosion preventable?" "Absolutely," I said. "A 48-hour shutdown and $200,000 in replacement materials would have prevented this entirely. We're talking about the cost of Garrett's car versus $35 million in damages and human lives at risk. And Mr. Cross was made aware of this recommendation. He called me an old-timer dinosaur and fired me for making it. Then he tried to cover it up by claiming I'd sabotaged his equipment. The trial was over before it really began. The evidence was overwhelming, the damages undeniable, and Garrett's attempts at cover-up only made his situation worse. He was convicted on federal charges of criminal negligence, workplace endangerment, and attempted obstruction of justice. But the real justice came in a different form entirely. 6 months after the explosion, I was standing in a classroom at the Federal Pipeline Safety Training Center in Oklahoma, looking at 30 young inspectors who would spend their careers preventing disasters like Summit Energy. On the wall behind me was a photograph of the pipeline crater, labeled "The Cost of Cutting Corners." "This is why we do what we do," I told them, the same way I'd told Danny Morrison before he learned it the hard way. "Every inspection report you file, every shutdown you order, every time you stand up to some suit who thinks schedules matter more than safety, you're saving lives. Don't ever let anyone tell you that experience doesn't matter." Agent Martinez had offered me the job as senior consultant for pipeline safety enforcement 6 months earlier, and I'd accepted immediately. Roy Washington was my deputy director now, training the next generation of inspectors the right way. Danny Morrison, after he recovered from his injuries, became one of our most dedicated students, a man who'd learned firsthand what happens when incompetence meets high pressure. Garrett Cross is serving 8 years in federal prison. His company was dissolved, his personal assets seized to pay damages. He went from corporate executive to convicted felon in less than a year, all because he thought 35 years of expertise could be replaced by arrogance and a golf buddy's signature. Here's what I learned and what I want every working man to understand. First, documentation is your lifeline. Those ultrasonic readings and pressure reports didn't just save my career, they prevented other people from dying in similar disasters. If it's not written down and witnessed, it didn't happen. Second, safety isn't negotiable. When a boss asks you to cut corners on something that could kill people, the answer is no. Not maybe, not just this once, not let me think about it. The answer is no. Period. End of discussion. And finally, know your worth. Garrett called me an old-timer dinosaur who could be replaced by cheaper labor. He found out the hard way that expertise isn't just knowledge. It's wisdom earned through decades of keeping people alive in dangerous situations. Don't let anyone discount your skills or pressure you into compromising safety. Stand your ground, keep your records, and never let them intimidate you into silence. Because when the smoke clears and the lawyers arrive, the truth always comes out, and the people who stood for safety are the ones still standing. If this story resonated with you, remember that every workplace has its Garrett Cross, someone who thinks deadlines matter more than lives. Don't let them bully you. Your expertise has value, your experience matters, and your voice can save lives. Stay safe out there. And remember, like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories about what happens when working folks stand up to corporate nonsense. Because there are a lot more stories where this one came from, and they all end the same way, with the truth winning out and the good guys getting the last word. Some battles are worth fighting, and safety is always one of them. In 35 years of pipeline work, I learned that respect isn't given. It's earned one safe job at a time. And once you earn it, never let some suit in an office take it away from you just because they think your experience costs too much. The difference between a professional and a pretender isn't the diploma on the wall or the title on the business card. It's what happens when the pressure gets high and lives are on the line. That's when you find out who really knows what they're doing.